If there's one recipe that makes me feel like I'm hosting a dinner straight out of an episode of Ina Garten's popular Food Network show, Barefoot Contessa, it is her pot roast. Like many, I have been a fan of hers and the show for as long as I can remember. So in today's video, I'm sharing my adaptation of her iconic recipe, company pot roast. I'll also be answering some of the most common questions I get, like how to make it without the Dutch oven, how to prepare it ahead of time, and how to make it without using alcohol. By the end, you will have everything you need to make this comforting dinner with confidence for your next special occasion. This recipe is featured in her cookbook Back to Basics, so if you have the book, feel free to follow along. If not, you can find my adaptation of the recipe on my website Foolproof Living, where it has been a reader favorite for years. Alright, without further ado, let's get started. We'll start by preparing the meat. We're using a boneless beef chuck roast because it's the perfect cup for slow cooking. It is a tougher cut of meat, but that's exactly what makes it ideal because when cooked low and slow, all that toughness melts away, leaving you with a meat that is fall apart tender and full of flavor. Still, if you can't find chuck roast, other cuts like eye-round roast, rump roast, or brisket will work beautifully too. We will need 4 to 5 pounds of meat. We do want some fat on it for flavor, but if there's a lot, feel free to remove some of it using a sharp knife. Next, we'll first dry it well on all sides with paper towels and then tie it with kitchen twine. Now, this step is important and one that you don't want to skip as it helps the meat hold its shape as it cooks so it looks as good as it tastes. And it's so simple. We'll take some kitchen string, double knot it around the middle, and work our way down on each side, tying it at 1-inch intervals. Next, we'll season the roast generously with 1 tablespoon of kosher salt, 1.5 teaspoons of ground black pepper on all sides. Then we'll dredge it in 5 tablespoons of flour, ensuring that it is evenly covered on all sides. We'll shake the excess flour and set that aside. Next, we'll move on to chopping a bunch of vegetables. This recipe uses 2 cups of carrots, 2 cups of yellow onions, 2 cups of celery, 5 large garlic cloves, and 2 cups of chopped leeks, both with the green and white parts. If you do not have leeks, you can use 2 more onions instead. Additionally, we will need a 28-ounce can of diced tomatoes, 1 cup of chicken stock, 2 cups of red wine. Now, Ina uses a Burgundy, but Cabernet is also a good alternative, 2 tablespoons of brandy or cognac, 3 branches of fresh thyme, and 2 branches of fresh rosemary, which I tied to make a small bouquet. Now, before we continue, let's talk about alcohol because I know some people prefer not to cook with it. If that is you, you can substitute 2 cups of red wine with 2 cups of chicken stock and just skip the cognac. However, in this recipe, red wine not only adds a deep, rich flavor, but also serves as the acidic element. To balance the flavors without wine, I recommend adding 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar, apple cider vinegar for a softer flavor, or red wine vinegar for something closer to the original. Now, the amount might be a little bit more depending on your taste buds, so I think it's best to give it a taste to get it just right. And I'll let you know later when to do that. Now that we have all the ingredients, we'll start cooking. But before, I want to talk about the equipment. This pot roast recipe is one of those that begins on the stove and then continues in the oven, so a large Dutch oven is ideal. And when I say large, I mean it. You need one that is at least 6 quarts or above. Now you might be wondering, what if I don't have a Dutch oven? Can I still make it? The answer is yes. You can sear the meat and cook the vegetables in a large pot, then transfer everything to a large casserole dish or a roasting pan and cover it tightly with aluminum foil before placing it in the oven. To sear the meat, we'll heat 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the Dutch oven over medium heat. Once the oil is shimmering, we'll add the roast and sear it for 4 to 5 minutes on each side. This step takes a little patience, but believe me, it's worth it. Our goal here is to get a nice golden crust on all sides of the meat. To do that, we'll use kitchen tongs to hold the roast as we sear the edges as well. Trust me, this is a crucial step to build good flavor. Once done, we'll transfer the meat to a plate, cover it with foil, and set it aside. Next, we'll cook the veggies. In the same Dutch oven, we'll heat 2 tablespoons of olive oil over medium heat. We'll then add the chopped carrots, onions, celery, celery, leeks, garlic, 1 tablespoon of kosher salt, and 1 teaspoon of black pepper. We'll cook it, stirring often until all vegetables soften. At this point, you don't need to brown the vegetables. They should be good to go in about 15 minutes. We'll stir in the wine and cognac, followed by the tomatoes and chicken stock. We'll give that a good mix while also scraping down the bottom bits. Next, we'll carefully put the roast back into the Dutch oven. Finally, we'll add the herb bouquet. Bring everything to a boil and let it simmer for about 15 minutes. We'll then put the lid on and place it in a preheated 325 degrees Fahrenheit oven and roast for 2.5 hours. Next, we'll turn down the heat to 250 Fahrenheit degrees and let it simmer at that low temperature for an hour. At this point, you don't need to remove the lid, just let it do its thing. When done, we'll carefully take it out of the oven, remove the pot roast onto a cutting board, and cover it loosely with aluminum foil. We'll discard the bundle of herbs and skim off the fat on top as much as possible. Now, as you can see, since my meat was not too fatty, I didn't have much to skim, but if yours is, you might have a lot more. So just skim as much as you can. At this point, you'll be left with a good amount of liquid in the pot, which we'll use to make the sauce. If you went with the alcohol-free version of this recipe, this is a good time to add the vinegar to the liquid. To a large container, we'll transfer half of the liquid with the vegetables and puree until smooth. As you can see, I am using an immersion blender, but a food processor fitted with the steel blade or a standing blender would also work. We'll pour the pureed sauce back into the pot, then turn the heat to medium-low and let it simmer for 15 minutes. At this point, it's a good idea to give it a taste also and add more seasoning if necessary. Meanwhile, we'll cut the strings off the roast and slice the meat. Alternatively, you can also use 2 forks to shred it into big chunks. When it comes to serving, I prefer a large platter because I think, along with the smell, it looks very impressive that way. To a large serving platter, we'll ladle some of the sauce at the bottom, arrange the meat on top, and spoon it with more sauce. It is optional, but I like to put some fresh rosemary on the side for a pop of color and a nice visual as well. You can pour the rest of the sauce into a bowl and serve it along with the meat so your guests can help themselves if they want to have more sauce. Also, I like to serve this pot roast on a bed of mashed potatoes, but creamy polenta, rice, mac and cheese would all be excellent side dishes to serve it with. If you need further inspiration for dishes to serve with your pot roast, I wrote a whole post on delicious side dishes to turn this meal to a feast. Now, before I let you go, I want to mention a few things. 1. Safety first. It goes without saying that this is a recipe that requires extreme caution. From searing 5 pounds of raw meat to carrying it from the stove to the oven to pureeing the hot liquid, you must be very careful as you perform each step, especially if you have kids around. Also, do not open the lid while it's simmering in the oven, especially in the beginning, because remember, there's wine in there. It is best to wait for the alcohol to evaporate before opening the lid. In general, I recommend not removing the lid, even to take a quick peek, until the first 2.5 hours of cooking time is fully completed. Number 2, this recipe makes a lot of sauce. Because the meat requires a good amount of liquid to cook, we end up with some extra sauce in the end. Rather than letting it go to waste, I recommend turning into a flavorful gravy. Strain the vegetables, then reduce the liquid on the stovetop for 20 to 25 minutes. You can then drizzle it over mashed potatoes, add it to beef tacos, or even use it as a decadent pasta sauce. 3. Making ahead. You can certainly make this recipe a day or 2 ahead. If you decide to go in that direction, remove it from the oven, let it cool down, and then transfer the whole thing to the fridge. On the day you're planning to serve it, you can warm it up in the oven, possibly in like a 325 degree oven for 30 to 40 minutes or until heated thoroughly, and then follow the recipe as written. Taking out the meat, making the sauce, etc. And finally, a few changes I made to the original recipe. When I first made this recipe, I followed it to a T. After several times of making this, however, I made a few changes of my own. For instance, I didn't add a chicken bouillon cube, which made the sauce too salty, at least for my taste. The other thing that I chose not to do was to add flour and butter to thicken the sauce at the end. Because I thought, 1, there was enough fat in the liquid, even after skimming most of it, and 2, it was already thick enough. If you watched this far, you know how to make a stellar pot roast. Most people refer to it as Sunday roast because As you saw it's a labor of love. If you're someone who wants to enjoy pot roast but don't have this much time to spare, you might like our pressure cooker pot roast as well. That recipe takes less than 2 hours from start to finish. It's a bit different, but I think it's just as good. Well, that sums it up all for me today. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Feel free to follow along. You might like our pressure pot. I'll get there. I'll get there one day.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. I can't stop it.
I have this much time to skate.